Welcome to the podcast series titled Global Resilience for National Cybersecurity, Strengthening the Interconnections Among Actors. This is Greta Nasi, co-director of the Master of Science in Cyber Risk Strategy and Governance, jointly offered by Bocconi University and Polytechnic of Milan. Together with Professor MacArthur, adjunct professor at Bocconi, we discuss with our guests key topics on the role of government and cybersecurity. This project was made possible thanks to a grant from the U.S. Mission to Italy, and it holds the patronage of the Italian Parliamentary Anti-Mafia Commission. This podcast is titled Cybercrime, State Legitimacy and Trust. The pandemic has brought two significant effects: the acceleration of digitalization and at the same time an economic crisis. These two crossover dynamics lead to a new sphere of crimes operated by individuals, groups, and criminal organizations. Digital innovations show new interpretations of crimes. It's therefore essential to understand its multidimensional scope, to avoid and prevent, to improve security and combat illegal activities and corruption. The goal of this podcast is to reflect on the nature of cybercrime in the current times and to look at the intertwines of illegal activities and organized crime activities in the cyberspace. And finally, to assess the pillars to govern and prevent criminal infiltration, illegal activities, and corruption at a transnational level. We would like to welcome our guests for this podcast: Robert Christensen, professor and George Romney Research Fellow at the Bingham Young University; Antonia De Meo, director at UNICRI, the United Nations Interregional Crime and Justice Research Institute; Corrado Giustozzi, board member at CLUSIT, the Italian Association for Computer Security; and Rauti, fellow at the PNRR Lab at Bocconi. Colin, over to you.
Antonia De Meo is the Director General of the United Nations Interregional Crime and Justice Institute. Director General De Meo, can you illustrate the current trends in crime and cybercrime at the global level, which raise challenges for state legitimacy?
UNICRI is the only UN research and training institute focused on criminal justice and crime prevention. So obviously, we would be interested in following global criminal trends. And we follow the cybercrime trends in particular through a center that we opened in The Hague on artificial intelligence and robotics. That center actually just celebrated its 5th anniversary, so we've been focused in this field for a little bit. From our perspective, the main current trend in cybercrime is that cybercrime is booming. It's booming everywhere, all across the globe. Malicious actors are launching increasingly complex attacks, and new technology is scaling up the reach and impact of cybercrime as a whole. The World Economic Forum recently estimated that as a global market, the cost of cybercrime may reach $10.5 trillion annually by 2025, and that's just 2 years away. But it's not just the immense financial cost. Are we okay? Yeah? Okay. Cybercrime also degrades trust among internet users and damages the reputations of legitimate service providers. So cybercrime also heightens tensions between countries, since governments and critical infrastructure are increasingly the targets of cyber attacks. So indeed, as Professor Nasi has suggested, the failures to adequately address cybercrime at home also impacts state legitimacy vis-a-vis international peers. Beyond the macro perspective, however, we've also seen interesting developments in recent years as to how cybercrime functions. Firstly, for example, cybercrime has many similarities with legitimate business in terms of how it operates. For example, they are both based on supply and demand. A key difference, however, is that cybercrime's underground market, often called the dark web, is anonymous, and access to it has traditionally been both difficult and strictly controlled. The dark web is designed, as many of you may know, with encrypted barriers to keep normal people out. But in our burgeoning digital age, barriers to enter the dark web have increasingly been lowered, meaning that those with even the most basic computer skills can now access these underground markets where all sorts of criminal goods and services can be easily procured. And this should be a concern to anyone interested to promote peace and justice. One of the most interesting recent developments in cybercrime for us at UNICRI is the concept of crime as a service model, a criminal business model that involves cyber criminals providing their services to potential customers on the dark web for a fee. This model allows any malicious actor with even the most basic cyber capabilities to launch a cyber attack by facilitating access to the necessary expertise and tools. With low barriers to enter the dark web, plus the crime as a service model, we're seeing more and more activity on the dark web. And interestingly, similar to legitimate businesses, competition among cyber criminals is driving down the price of malicious services on the dark web, which in turn makes them more accessible. At UNICRI, we're interested in this phenomenon because we're looking into cyber-enabled terrorism. Traditionally, terrorist groups such as ISIS and Al-Qaeda have not carried out effective and sophisticated cyber and technology-based attacks. And this is primarily because they lack the necessary capabilities or funding, or they're simply not organized enough to do so. However, the crime as a service model could be a game changer in terms of cyber-enabled terrorism. And it challenges us to consider whether we may see terrorist groups leveraging more advanced cyber tools and techniques in the future, such as AI-enabled ransomware attacks or AI-powered decryption techniques. Later this year, UNICRI is going to be launching a research into open source and the dark web together with the UN Office on Counterterrorism to identify if and how terrorist groups and individual criminals are using the crime as a service model and other malicious opportunities of the dark web.
Corrado Giustozzi is from CLUSIT, the Italian Association for Computer Security. Mr. Giustozzi, can you tell us, based on CLUSIT's latest report, what are the trends in cybercrime in Italy and what are the challenges Italy faces?
Our data, which have been collected since almost 10 years and classified in a consistent way, although 5 or 4 years ago we slightly changed the rules for deciding the severity of the incident, show us that Italy is facing a constant trend of growth in cybercrime activity. In those last, let's say, 3 or 4 years, cybercrime attacks have grown by more than 100% year to year, 130% or so. Most attacked are public administration, especially healthcare. Less attacked are finance and banking institutions, probably because they are more protected. They are already knowledgeable about the threats and have invested a huge amount of money to protect themselves. Thing that public administration didn't do. Most of the attacks are conducted by means of ransomware, or let's say malware in general, most of which is ransomware. And ransomware is becoming the most used weapon attacking targets because it's easy to deploy, and it has very low risk of being identified and caught by the police. During the pandemic, we also observed a growth of, let's say, old and traditional crime like selling fake products or just phishing, because, of course, people stayed a lot more at home in a psychological state of doubt and fear and insecurity, so they were much more vulnerable to threats conducted against the human and on the machines.
Robert Christensen is a professor at the Marriott Business School at Brigham Young University, as well as a George Romney Research Fellow there. Rob, we feel intuitively that misbehaviors shape people's views of government workers, maybe even more so than private sector workers. But what does your latest research tell us?
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. One of the things that we are really interested in and think it has a lot of application to cybersecurity, cybercrime, the perceptions that individual citizens have of government services, cybersecurity being one of those public goods that government helps facilitate. And so our research more generally, I would say it's a little bit of a context research for understanding cybersecurity. We look at whether people perceive similar behaviors or misbehaviors differently depending on whether those behaviors occur in a government setting or in a for-profit business setting. And interestingly, government is very, very often punished or penalized for misbehaviors in ways that private organizations are not penalized. We think this has some pretty important implications for how we understand a range of policy issues, including cybersecurity, because at the very, I guess, most elemental level, it means that we need to train our civil servants and IT professionals, people who are helping to provide a more safe virtual world, with the understanding that there are higher expectations for what they do.
Walter Rauti is from the National Recovery and Resilience Plan Lab at Bocconi. Mr. Rauti, if we focus on organized crime, how have illegal activities evolved, and what should cyber policies take into account?
We have not to consider the organized crime like in the past, because it's normal that organized crime evolve in the future and invest in digital innovation. So if we consider the mafia, I mean 'Ndrangheta, Cosa Nostra, Camorra, the Italian mafia, actually, they switched from different organizations. In the past, they used soldiers with guns. Actually, they use soldiers with a keyboard. Just because it's important to understand that in the future, the position of organized crime that want to control, in general, the territory, is to control even the cyberspace. So in the future, the fight against the organized crime will be, in effect, cybersecurity.
So today we've heard about an ongoing increase in criminal activity on the internet and in cyberspace. And we can count that in a number of ways. We can count an increasing number of attacks, varying kinds of attacks on varying sets of institutions and domains. We can also start to count the loss, the monetary loss, the economic productivity loss, and sometimes loss in other more human forms, lives affected by ransomware, by health systems incapacitated by cybercrime, and so on. So this is obviously an increasingly important area to study and for organizations and governments to work on. I think we heard that one of the primary current approaches to this new upswing in cyber activity is what we call capacity building. That is, trying to build the capacity of organizations, their ability to respond and deter cyber criminality. And that takes many different forms. Training organizational staff to be more secure, creating new communication channels between organizations and governments, creating data collection and sharing agreements and tools, and even building better intelligence for organizations to respond to cybercrime from. But I also heard from today's speakers some hints about the future of managing cybercriminality. And I'm going to talk about three of those in general. The first is that when it comes to the defenders and the protectors, we need to increasingly focus our response not just on organizations and capacity building with them, but to individuals. So, in other words, we need to be thinking about the roles that everyday people, not just people acting in organizations, play in responding to cybercrime. We heard from a number of speakers how this is already happening. We heard about the UN's efforts to build individual cybercrime resilience activities to encourage individual people to better configure and prepare themselves for potential crime. We also heard about how the pandemic has really made this even more important. People are increasingly working from home. They're using their devices outside the realm of their organizations. And with that in mind, they are more responsible for their own security. But this kind of individual focus happens in other ways, too, right? We start to notice that individual judgments, so how individuals feel about governments and crime response, are just as important as how they feel about organizations, right? And in reality, Professor Christensen's work shows us that when people think of cybercriminal activities within a government, they're really making these individual level assessments. So we need to move from thinking just about organizations to individuals on the defensive side. But how about when it comes to the criminals themselves? Here, I think we need to move away from the mythology of the single hacker in a hoodie, the individual hacker conducting criminal activities, and move to a more organizational approach. We heard repeatedly today how individuals have probably never been as responsible for cybercrime as we thought, but increasingly are not at all the focus of criminal activity. Instead, cybercrime is being carried out by sophisticated networks of multinational criminal organizations. You can pay these organizations to do crimes on the internet for you, this crime as a service concept. And really, individuals are finding their places within these broader criminal organizations or enterprises. So on one hand, we need our defensive viewpoint to move from just organizations to individuals. But then when we're thinking about who the criminals are themselves, we need to start thinking about organizations instead of just the lone hacker. And as we do both those things, I think we also caught a glimpse of a third and very important shift. We have been measuring crime largely in terms of its immediate outputs and effects, the number of attacks, the amount of money stolen. But in reality, each of these crimes has further knock-on effects to society. It changes how people view their governments. It changes how people trust private entities they work with. These outcomes, these second and third degree effects, are just as important as the outputs themselves. And we notice that cutting-edge organizations are starting to measure those and even manage their programs based on those outcomes in cybercrime rather than outputs. If I had to summarize the whole approach that we've been hearing about today, it's about moving from focusing simply on particular systems with particular criminals and zooming out to take an ecosystem view of how to protect and create a society resilient to cybercriminal activity. We need to think about not just what individual or organizations do, but at all of these different levels, individual, organization, and society, as well as about the outcomes of these attacks, these crimes, and also their deterrence.
Thank you to our guests, and thank you to the audience for listening to this podcast.